There's something we rarely question in our lives. We are told from childhood that living for others is noble. We are praised when we put aside our own desires in order to satisfy the needs of family, friends, or society. And yet, if you look closely, there is a subtle danger hidden in this ideal. Because when we live only for others, when every action is shaped by their expectations, we may slowly lose sight of who we really are. Think about it. How often do you find yourself doing something not because you truly want to, but because you are afraid of disappointing someone? It could be your parents, your partner, your boss, or even society at large. You study a subject not because you love it, but because your parents said it was practical. You accept a job not because it excites you, but because it makes you appear successful in the eyes of others. You marry not out of love, but because the world says you're supposed to. And all the while, something inside you is quietly suffocating. Krishnamurti often pointed out that this pattern of living, this endless search for approval, is a form of slavery. Not the slavery of chains, but of psychological dependence. He asked, how can there be freedom when every choice is driven by fear of judgment? How can there be love, or joy, or truth, if the self is always being shaped by what others demand? The irony is, most of us think we are being selfless when we sacrifice ourselves for others. We call it kindness, we call it love. But is it truly love if it comes from fear? If you say yes to your friend, not because your heart says yes, but because you are afraid of being rejected, is that really love? Or is it simply fear disguised as generosity? This is where the danger lies. When we lose ourselves in the expectations of others, we create a false image of who we are. And then we spend years defending that image. We wake up one day and realize we don't even know what we want, what we value, or what brings us joy. Our lives become secondhand, borrowed from the dreams of others. Krishnamurti would ask us to pause here, to look without judgment, to simply observe. Are we living authentically, or are we living as copies of what society tells us to be? He would say that to live authentically is not selfishness. It is actually the foundation of true relationship. Because if you have lost yourself, what exactly are you offering to others? A mask, an imitation, and no mask can sustain love. Take a moment to reflect. Think of a time when you agreed to something you didn't really want. Maybe it was a career choice. Maybe it was attending a social event. Maybe it was staying in a relationship that felt empty. Outwardly, you smiled. You said, "Of course I'll do it." But inwardly, there was resistance. You felt drained. That quiet resistance is the voice of your true self. It whispers, "This isn't me." And the more you ignore that whisper, the more it fades. Until one day you can't even hear it anymore. That silence of the inner voice is the greatest loss. Because without it, we no longer know how to live. We can follow rules. We can fulfill duties. But the spark of being alive, the creativity, the curiosity, the sense of wonder gets buried. And then we wonder why life feels empty, why we feel restless even when everything looks perfect on the outside. Krishnamurti would often say that the beginning of wisdom is self-knowledge. But self-knowledge is impossible if you are constantly wearing masks for others. If you want to know yourself, you must be willing to stand alone, to disappoint others if necessary, to risk being misunderstood, because only then can you discover what is truly yours. And here's the paradox. When you discover who you truly are, when you stop living only for others, that's when you can actually give something real to the world. Because then, your actions are not coming from fear or duty. They come from love. They come from authenticity. Imagine helping a friend, not because you are afraid of losing them, but because your whole being genuinely wants to help. That kind of love has no bitterness, no resentment, no hidden agenda. It is free. But when you give without authenticity, resentment always follows. Haven't you noticed? You sacrifice for others, you put yourself last, and after a while, you begin to feel unappreciated. You begin to say, "I gave so much," and they don't even notice. That bitterness is the proof that your giving was not truly free. It was tied to an expectation of return. And when the return doesn't come, you feel betrayed. So Krishnamurti invites us to look very honestly. Are we giving freely, Or are we giving because we are afraid to lose approval? Are we living from the center of who we are? Or are we constantly adjusting ourselves like actors on a stage? To see this truth without judgment is the first step toward freedom. Because freedom does not mean rejecting others. It does not mean living in isolation. It means discovering who you are so that when you are with others, your presence is real. And only from that place can love exist. When you begin to see this clearly, something shifts inside. You realize that much of what you called love was actually fear. Much of what you called duty was actually conditioning. And much of what you called sacrifice was a quiet form of self-betrayal. This realization can feel uncomfortable at first. It can feel as if the ground beneath you is shaking, because the life you've built was based on pleasing others. But this discomfort is not a mistake. It's the beginning of truth breaking through the surface. Most people avoid this discomfort. They prefer the safety of approval. They say to themselves, "It's easier if I just go along with it. Why make things complicated? Why hurt anyone?" And so they continue. But notice what happens. By avoiding short-term discomfort, they invite long-term suffering. Their life becomes heavier, quieter, duller. They smile on the outside but feel hollow on the inside. And eventually, even those they tried to please can sense the emptiness. Because you cannot hide a false life forever. Krishnamurti would say that the real courage is not in sacrificing yourself for others, but in facing yourself honestly. Can you sit with the fact that you have been living according to others' expectations? Can you see it without blaming them, without blaming yourself, without running away? Just see it. That clarity itself begins to free you. Because once you see the pattern, it no longer controls you unconsciously. Think about relationships for a moment. How many of them are built on mutual masks? You play the role of the good son, the supportive partner, the loyal employee, while the other person plays their role. Both sides are performing, and so the relationship looks stable on the outside, but inside, there is no real contact. Two masks are interacting, not two living human beings. And we wonder why relationships often collapse, or why they feel dry even when they continue. What happens if instead of playing the role, you show up as yourself, without the mask, without the fear? At first, others may resist. They may say, "You've changed, you're being selfish." But is it selfish to be honest? Or is it selfish to demand that someone keep living a lie just to keep you comfortable? This is where love is tested. Because if someone truly loves you, they will want you to live as yourself, not as a copy of their expectations. And if they cannot accept that, then perhaps the relationship was never love to begin with. It was dependence. It was a contract. I'll play my role if you play yours. That's not love. That's a bargain. Krishnamurti challenges us to see the difference. To see that most of what we call love is actually dependence dressed up in beautiful words. And when you depend on someone else for your identity, for your sense of worth, you are no longer free. Freedom in this sense is not about running away from people. It's not about becoming cold or detached. It's about discovering a way of being where your presence is genuine, where you can say yes when you mean yes, and no when you mean no. Where your actions are not reactions to fear, but expressions of truth. That kind of living may not always be comfortable, but it carries a certain peace, a certain lightness, because you are no longer divided inside. And perhaps the most beautiful part is this: when you live from that place, you actually have more to give to others, not less. Because you are not drained by constant pretense. You are not exhausted by playing roles. You are alive. You are present. And in that presence, the love you offer is real. But this journey is not simple. The conditioning runs deep. From childhood, we are trained to seek approval, to be the good child, the obedient student, the successful adult. These roles are so ingrained that we mistake them for who we are. Breaking free from them requires vigilance. It requires daily awareness. Every moment becomes an opportunity to ask, am I doing this because it's true for me, or because I'm afraid of what others will think? That question, asked honestly, can change your life. So the question remains, Will you keep living according to the patterns handed to you, or will you begin to listen to that quiet voice within? No one else can answer this for you. No teacher, no book, no philosophy. The answer can only come from your own awareness, from your own willingness to look honestly at your life. Living for others may appear noble, but if it means losing yourself, then what is being offered is only a shadow, not the real you. And the world doesn't need more shadows. It needs people who are alive, awake, authentic. Because only then can love be real. Only then can relationships be true. Krishnamurti reminds us that the discovery of truth begins now, in the very act of observing. To see when you are acting out of fear. To see when you are betraying yourself. And in that seeing, without judgment, a new life begins. A life not built on imitation, not built on masks, but on the freedom of being fully yourself. And when you live from that freedom, you do not abandon others. You finally have something real to give.